Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Williams Gamaker and I am an artist, filmmaker and researcher working with UAL's Decolonising Archives Institute for the period of this residency. I'm now going to share that research with you, and that I named Knees and Breasts and Mountains, the art school reimagined, a time-travelling script in 3 parts, which I shall say a bit more about. I'm going to do an intro. I'm going to read some excerpts from the time-travelling script from 1924, from 1987, from 1921, and end with some reflections. And I've just to give you a sense of the format today, because we can't be in person, I'm sharing my desktop with you and the text. As a filmmaker, I've been increasingly relying on scripts as a format. I'm very interested in it, and I use that in my filmmaking and increasingly within my academic writing. So I'm going to start with some context about the project, and I share the script, the text with you and the script so that you can read along if you wish to. So the experience of art schools within the UK for students from intersectional backgrounds is something that I often return to within my work with multiple institutions across the UK, and in particular through my work at Goldsmiths on the BA Fine Art programme. As an artist and academic and a person of colour, my lived experience of art school studying at Middlesex University between 1998 and 2001 was, on the whole, a positive one. I was one of a handful of students of colour on the course, specifically South Asian, first generation British Sri Lankan. I loved the course and was fortunate to feel connected to my peers. I worked with performance and video, as these were the most accessible and affordable ways to make art. My material was often my own body for the same reasons. With hindsight, I was, like most undergraduates from intersectional backgrounds, wrestling with my identity through my work, and that early desire to explore representation through race, gender, and sexuality has never gone away. When I undertook my postgraduate studies between 2005 and 2012 at Goldsmiths on the MA in Visual Anthropology and Fine Art PhD programmes, I continued with longer-term goals to expand my practice and to teach in higher education. I began to feel the resistance of the institution during my employment as a lecturer on the BA Fine Art programmes at Kingston and Goldsmiths in 2014. Here, my marginality as one of the few tutors of colour seemed amplified. I felt the burden of trying to hold the concerns of my students of colour, who expressed a real desire to speak to their lived experiences and to address the gaps in the curriculum that failed to respond to the questions of identity that had been arguably bypassed and overlooked in favour of a dated and regurgitated curriculum. My awakening, so to speak, occurred through my work with a Women of Colour Index reading group between 2016 and 2019, together with co-founders Samia Malik and Rahana Zaman. WACI is a collection of slides and exhibition ephemera collated by artist Rita Keegan, who indexed women of colour artists working in the UK during the 1980s and 1990s. This invaluable archive evidences the precarious nature of practice for marginalised identities and the hard-won position of these individuals who fought for their work to be exhibited and received with parity in an evidently more racist and resistant landscape for artists of colour within the arts. Through our work, the WACI Reading Group, we developed a range of extracurricular events, and through this additional curriculum, it really became very clear to me that there was such an absence of Black artists within my own education. And this was a denial of a rich history of Black British artists and global artists beyond the white canon. Many of the artists worked tirelessly in the so-called critical decades of the 80s and 90s to pave the way for artists like myself, A number are gaining the belated attention that their practice deserves, but many remain in a kind of artist purgatory, insufficiently documented, reduced to traces within the archive. I experienced a delayed but no less palpable manifest violence of an active censorship within the art schools I studied in and education more broadly. And remarkably, I had no tutors of colour throughout my entire education, with the exception of 2 tutorials with artist filmmaker Steve McQueen in Amsterdam at the Ateliers. This paucity of access to artists that I might find meaningful connection with on the basis of a shared lived experience perhaps signals my commitment to working as an academic in addition to my artistic practice, which continuously looks to representation and structural inequalities within specifically the context of the film industry. And also it highlights the urgency of work supported by initiatives such as the Decolonising Arts Institute. When I applied for the residency, I intended to produce 3 scripts that weave my fictional activist responses to the Henry Moore Archive and the Chelsea College of Art Archive, known as the Chelsea the Chelsea Collections and Archives. Henry Moore had a long-standing and important relationship with the school, first as Chelsea's head of sculpture, and from 1932 to 39, and latterly through the school's 1960 acquisition of his sculpture 2-piece reclining figure. Which the archive focuses on. The purchase of his work undoubtedly reflects that what was in vogue at the time, but its prominence as a centrepiece of the new art school also cements an ideology for the students of the 60s and those who followed about what artistic practice should look like. And the sculpture in turn becomes an emblem for the ethos of the school, in this case something weighty, fixed and undoubtedly macho. Sir Lawrence Gowing, head of Chelsea School of Art in 1964, was involved in a number of purchases of the artworks for the school's collection. In the space of a couple of years, alongside Moore's sculpture, he bought Duchamp's 1935 roto-reliefs, Gerrit Rietveld's 1918 chair, and the original 1925 La Révolution Surréaliste journals. More evidence of the old boys' network and the endless references to white European male artists that trickled down into my art school education of the 1990s, late 1990s. This project is not about Henry Moore, believe it or not, but I will quote him, and his name will be mentioned, but I'm trying to look beyond Moore to something that really relates to now, resonates with today. When describing his 1934 4-piece composition Reclining Figure, he explains, I realised what an advantage a separated composition could have in relating figures to landscape. Knees and breasts are mountains. Once these parts become separated, you don't expect it to be a naturalistic figure. Therefore, you can justifiably make it like a landscape or not. I like this methodology of a separated composition, and what I want to do is use it to serve my purpose. What happens if elements of the archive become separated from their context? Could I justifiably repurpose the archive, like Moore's abstracted knees and breasts, to reimagine moments from Chelsea's history? Moore's abstracted human figures are made of stone and bronze and often pierced with hollows. These holes or gaps in the material offer a rich territory to project onto and to map the absent or overlooked histories of the artists of colour who studied and worked at Chelsea over the years. For the purpose of this residency, I am the self-appointed external examiner. I chose to work with Chelsea's archives because it is the institution in UAL's consortium that I have little connection with. I have not taught there, I have no ties to staff, and as such, I hope to maintain objectivity in my approach, as is required of all external examiners. I will endeavour to respect the histories of all concerned, but the text will employ a healthier reverence to the patriarchal context of the past I am researching, to time and to the laws of physics. To carry out my investigation, I will time travel into the archives returning to 1964, 1987 and 2021, where the archive has yet to be formed or is newly formed or forming. But it is my hope that this text will contribute to the shifts in format from notes to admissions of failure to scripts, which I use within my filmmaking practice and find particularly useful to draw out the scene and content of the narrative I wish to construct. So I'm starting with an image which has been altered with. I came across Henry Moore's image of the installation of the two-piece reclining figure, and I wondered at the beginning of my research residency how I might find my way into this network of men, this network of white men. And as it became clearer that I would become the external examiner, I found my way in next to Lawrence Gowing, who you can see by my side, who is the head of Chelsea School of Art. I just want to thank Gustavo Grandal Montero before I read this excerpt, who was academic support librarian at Chelsea College of Arts and Camberwell College of Arts, who was the one who supported me to gain access to the material. So I'm just going to read a small excerpt here. Henry Moore Archive, 8th of July 2021. The content of the grey cardboard archival box is sparse. It contains some black and white photographs, an exhibition catalogue and correspondence relating to the purchase of Moore's sculpture. Minutes from meetings, a small unsigned sketch from 1963, unattributed but most likely Moore's, and plans for a motorised revolving plinth to support the sculpture. Leafing through, I am intrigued to find a picture taken by Tony Rogers on the 25th of March 1964 of artist Henry Moore wearing a dapper tweed raincoat with furrowed brow. And Moore looks off to the right, something beyond the frame. I am standing next to Lawrence Gowing. He is the head of the school. Just going to go back to that image so that you can see it. He's the head of the school. We both have clipboards in hand. I have no clue what he has written, but I have kept my records. Gowing is a tall Englishman, and next to him my diminutive frame seems exaggerated. I am brown, the first-generation daughter of a Sri Lankan migrant, but this black and white photo doesn't highlight the difference between me and the white men I am surrounded by. My brownness is muted here, but it is felt acutely at the time. I am tired and I'm beginning to show my age, which is ironic because in general people tend to infantilise me within the workplace. I have a serious look on my face, and perhaps I am performing this to befit the gravitas of the occasion, and perhaps I do so to hold my place within the establishment of this old boys' club. Does this weariness signal my future relationship with higher education? The sculpture too plays its part in emasculating all in its bulky presence, particularly the workers hunched and focused on safely securing the work to its final location. I have written the following. In 1964, two existing schools, the School of Art, part of Chelsea Polytechnic, and the Polytechnic School of Art, based in Great Titchfield Street, merged to create the new Chelsea School of Art in Manresa Road, Chelsea. It is due for completion at the end of March 1964 and is the first post-war my notes. I'm sorry. It is the first post-war building that the London County Council has designed specifically for art education. Installation of Henry Moore's two-piece reclining figure, number 1, a bronze with green patina. One piece surprisingly phallic, a weighty protrusion, semi-erect in form, the other recognisably a torso, a body interrupted, mounted on a cylindrical, large plinth, hard to detect, knees, and if she is a she, her breasts aren't like any I know, definitely the work of a man. She rests on stumps and has no arms. I am most intrigued by the space in between. This work is clearly the centrepiece of the new art school and has been purchased to showcase the arts. Note, ask Gowing to expound on what this means about arts today and to speculate on how this work will be read by students in the 21st century. Okay, so that's just a small section of the text. I am reminded of the class dynamics of this scene. I'm not quite sure where I fit within them, but my own understanding of class is warped by time, 20 years of working within higher education as a student and academic, and my diasporic lived reality. My presence as the external examiner seems novel to the men, even superfluous, but I insist to Gowing that such appointments support good practice at the school and ensures due diligence, which he agrees to. I wonder what the working class men installing the sculpture think about the object that they are grappling with and the artist standing next to them, whose frame by that point has surpassed the professional art world, becoming a name that has entered the popular consciousness. Okay, so I'm now going to move forward because the Chelsea College of Art archive, outside of the other one I was looking at, the Henry Moore archive, contains many records documenting the establishment of the new school and details the college's activities to the present day. It includes prospectuses, degree show and other catalogues and student publications. It does not include full details of the past alumni, but items do date back to the 1920s, but the bulk is from 1964 onwards. Records relating to the earlier history of the art school are held at King's College London. So when I was looking through the Excel sheet that Gustavo kindly gave me, which has all the Chelsea graduates dating back to 1963, I mentioned that I was hoping to map the absent or overlooked histories of artists of colour who studied at Chelsea, but I really quickly realised that this was not easy to find through names. There weren't really any. Once you get further back in time, there's no websites, there's really very little to follow up on, and I was clutching at straws to a certain extent. So I really didn't know what I was looking for, and I couldn't see any people of colour documented in the photographs or the catalogues from the several boxes that were on my desk. So the evident whiteness of the art school of the 60s reflects obviously the opportunities that were afforded to those who could choose a creative pathway as a potential vocation. To a certain extent, that still plays out today, obviously to a lesser degree. But this also reflects the context of England, and despite the then burgeoning multicultural London of the 60s, it was symptomatic of the cultural choices around that was deemed suitable for a career for first-generation migrants. So I would argue that this choice of whether to participate in art education or not still impacts individuals from intersectional backgrounds, and that navigating education as a minority within a majority white experience remains a personal challenge for each student who chooses to do so. So we move forward to 1987. Here is an image of Donald Rodney on the left and Keith Piper installing their installation, The Next Turn of the Screw, for The Devil's Feast from 1987, which was the first ever London Arts College Black Artists Only exhibition. May 1987. I am walking to Chelsea School of Arts Gallery at Manresa Road. I pass Moore's reclining figure. Since my last visit, the bronze has weathered more. It is greener than I remember. If we were in a forest, I think she might camouflage well. Here among London's greys, she is distinctly conspicuous. She remains a strong presence, taking up space and commanding our attention with her scale. Perhaps this is what Moore always intended, to make oversized sculptures that exude authority through an overbearing scale. To overcome this, I concentrate on the gap between the sculpture's two elements. This time, I can see a large wooden sculpture painted black and white. It is an appendage to the gallery, a makeshift door shaped like an oversized coffin. This is my introduction to Devil's Feast, a group exhibition held between 27th of April and 8th of May 1987, including 6 artists: Donald Rodney, Keith Piper, Chyla Berman, Jennifer Comrie, Alan D'Souza and Zarina Bimji. As I enter the show, aware of the coffin I have walked through, an undeniable symbol of death, whose, perhaps mine or the institution's, I am handed a fold-out exhibition pamphlet printed on white card with capitalised black text with a serif font. And so I'm just going to say a little more about the show. The introduction opens with some pointed questions to Chelsea School of Art that highlight in general the context of distrust and perhaps even paranoia that I recognise to this day. Their words, written in the late 80s, continue to permeate the thinking of people of colour when approached to work with institutions. This unsolicited shadow of tokenism is real and gnaws away at self-worth. The fact that these questions sit near the top of this text, written by the artist, is in effect what frames the exhibition, and this saddens and frustrates me. Why was Chelsea suddenly so interested in showing work by black artists? I'm quoting from the artist's text. Was it for their own credibility? Were they trying to get a black art show on the cheap? Or was this a form of a serious and committed intervention into the functioning of art school, an attempt to challenge the underlying racism of its structure? I am struck by the next turn of the screw, a collaborative installation between Piper and Rodney. It shows 6 skillfully rendered portraits, intentionally composed as a lineup of black faces to evidence the horrific number of black people who have been murdered, raped and maimed by British police. Quote from Eddie Chambers' Problematic Space, The Devil's Feast for Race Today, written in 1987. The duo's inclusion of Next Clothes Shop in Wolverhampton is yet another life needlessly lost and a tragic statistic of an ongoing systemic racism in the British police force. Hence the title and the turn of the screw, which implies an action that makes a bad situation worse. Also imaged is Cherry Gross and Cynthia Jarrett, who both experienced police brutality. The artists in the show wrote the following statement: our own art practice is integrated into our daily lives, which cannot be separated from our work as artists. Our work then is part of a larger social and political framework and has to be seen within that context. The following words ring true for many artists of colour working in higher education and arts institutions today, suggesting the need for intercultural solidarity remains as vital as it does within the context of this show. Another quote from the exhibition catalogue: as African and South Asian artists dealing with white institutions and white ideologies, we are continuously forced to be on the defensive, trying to protect the few opportunities available to us. So I won't read this all now, but I'd love it if you could access the research on the Decolonising Arts Institute website. I then decided to have a conversation with artist Keith Piper, who features in the Devil's Feast exhibition. And as you can see from the script, I compose our interview as a script between the two of us. And Keith, during this interview, reflects on some of the reasoning behind the show and an explanation also of his work with Donald Rodney. And what was wonderful whilst doing this research residency is I managed to meet up with Chyla, who was very busy and said that she couldn't reach out to me to talk about the work. But Keith kindly did. But it was great to see Chyla during one of her installations for hospital rooms. And I also reached out to Gavin Yankees, who was somebody I really wanted to speak to, but we only managed to have email correspondence. That Gavin was the first and only full-time senior lecturer in the fine arts at London's top art colleges post-1945 in the mid-80s. And it's really important to emphasise that, because it shows you that the minority that I speak of when I talk of my own teaching must have felt so much more profound in the mid-80s. And as I come to the final part of my script, I reached out to a number of graduating MA students. They've now subsequently graduated. These were individuals who were most affected by the first lockdown. Their degree went straight into being an online format, as we all did during that period of time. So the idea of communal bonds and collaboration became one that was digitally mediated. So I write just to frame things in light of my conversation with Keith Piper, and in light of the external examiner's conversation with Keith Piper and her correspondence with Gavin Yankees. The external examiner sits in a wooden panelled space surrounded by books and portraits of bygone white scholars. She's sitting in the old library of Chelsea College of Arts. It's early evening. She has contacted 5 Chelsea College of Arts MFA graduates to collate informal but vital feedback on how the college works today, which has been severely impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. The external examiner has identified this to be a key moment to explore, to hear the experiences of artists from intersectional backgrounds within higher education 30 years on, and the students are all individuals who identify as BIPOC. They were interviewed separately but are aware of each other's students, each of the other students selected, making frequent reference to one another. They have agreed to feedback to the external examiner, who has been undertaking a self-initiated review as part of her research for UAL's Decolonising the Archives Institute. On reflection, the meetings could have been convened together as the external examiner now pieces together the individual responses into a fantasy group conversation to counter the isolation of the pandemic and the necessary online context in which she finds herself. This format hopes to make space for these individuals to be heard, and the condensed, consolidated format is designed for ease of reading her findings. An open laptop emits blue light in the gloom. She is poised for note-taking. I won't in this moment read from the artists' responses, because I think this would work most well if we would read it together. I don't want to put my voice into their words. Unfortunately, because of different time zones and limits with budgets, I haven't been able to do that, but I do hope you'll be able to read the text. I will just sum up now, just a short bit more before I end my presentation. As I come to the end of my journey through the archive, the possibility of a conclusion feels problematic. The archive does not end. It is ever expanding, and this text cannot help but respond to the text that precede it and inevitably it will form a symbolic sandwich to the text that will follow it. For now, it contributes to the growth of UAL's Decolonising Archives Institute's archive, but simultaneously resists the archive, knowing the archive is also a place where things get lost and potentially don't see the light of day again. I have found my potentiality in the connections forged during this research. For example, working with Zishen Wang, one of the artists that I collaborated with. I totally have not mentioned. I want to mention, at the very least, all the artists that I did work with. They are Nisa Khan, Sarah David, Mariam Hina Hasnain, Chuni Wu, and Zicheng Wang. Yeah. I just come back to the bit that I was reading. Yes, so for example, working with Zicheng Wang has enabled a connection to the East Asian Women's Artists Community group, which, through another collaboration, A Particular Reality, has offered a meeting space for students from East and Southeast Asia to connect and collaborate interinstitutionally across Chelsea, Goldsmiths and Kingston School of Art. The Chelsea of 1964 is a spectre. Moore's two-piece reclining figure number 1 is on loan to the Henry Moore Foundation. Its monumentality no longer speaks to the collaborative, relational and intimate conversations that are forming among the current students, in particular among the students of colour, who are taking up space and pushing for parity without apology through their work. Like many in higher education institutions, Chelsea attempts to steady itself within the continuing pandemic, and my move through the annals makes clear that the work of decolonising, if such a thing is possible, is and always will be a work in progress. The findings of the external examiner point to an institution conceding space and power to the students to embrace more reciprocal co-learning environments. Dialogue in a period of extended atomization also seems of vital importance if we are to proceed not only in the recent impact of the pandemic, but also the countless and complex issues of being heard, of being seen, of being included, and that the work made forms part of a nuanced, non-tokenized contribution to the art school for any marginalized individual who chooses to do a creative degree. So, I would like to wrap up there and say that it's been wonderful to be part of this residency. What has been a real shame is that invariably we have still remained online and continue through this presentation to be online, and of course that's changing now, but it would have been wonderful to have been in the room with my co-researchers, and hopefully that opportunity will happen at a later date. But for now, I'd like to say thank you and hope that this has been of use to you all.